night wind whipped against the canvas tarp, carrying the mixed smells of burning wood, horsehide, and gunpowder, the breath of the frontier. On the gravel patch, Logan's campfire flickered, stretching his tall, broad shadow into a black slash across the night. He had just driven the horses in, his back raw from the sun, his left hand resting out of habit on the holstered Colt, his right hand cupping a tin of bitter coffee. Logan lifted his head. Firelight flashed in his steel-gray eyes. His fingers slid over the revolver's grip. Not an animal. This breathing was ragged. Stumbling footsteps, cloth rustling. Under the thin crescent moon, a thin figure emerged. Torn buckskin dress, tangled black hair, shoulders bent under hunger. Stop. Logan rose, his boots grinding the gravel. The Colt's barrel gleamed in the firelight. The shadow jerked, bread tumbling from her hand. She turned. A hollow face, sunken cheeks, eyes burning red. A tarnished silver bead necklace around her throat. He didn't need to ask. Apache. She froze, then dropped to her knees. Her forehead pressed into the sand, hands raised, crumbs stuck to her palms. Her voice rasped like dry paper. Don't shoot. I was only hungry. Spare me. I will serve you. Anything you ask. Logan kept the barrel steady. Hunger had carved her. Calves scraped raw. Cracked heels. Wrists bearing the old mark of rope. The fire bent her shadow until it looked half human, half ghost. You stole. Logan's voice was flat, heavy. Here, thieves usually die where they stand. I know. She lifted her head, eyes dull black but not vicious, only clinging to life. 3 days without food. Give me a chance. I'll cook, stoke fires, wash clothes, tend horses. I'll do it. Just broken trail of footprints leading in. In this desert, strength alone didn't keep you alive. Sometimes, survival meant bowing at the right moment. If I spare you, Logan said slowly, you follow me. Work, never run. One lie, one broken word. I won't repeat myself. I hear you. Her whisper sank into the sand. He shoved a water skin toward her. 2 gulps. No more Takia cradled it like a relic, sipped tiny mouthfuls, lips trembling. When finished, she set it down neat, eyes lowered. Logan nodded faintly, as if closing an old ledger. Sleep at the fire's edge, he told her, pulling his blanket across his shoulders. Between us, the flames. Takia retreated to the rim of the light, curled herself in shadow. Her narrow shoulders trembled, then stilled. Firelight caught the corner of her eyes, turning them into 2 tired glass beads. Night thickened. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of trampled grass. Logan didn't sleep. His hand stayed near the Colt, though his grip had loosened. He listened to her breathing. The sun hung high like a burning coal, scorching the desert sky. The dusty trail stretched endless, the heat so fierce, the very air shimmered like a molten mirror. On that road, two figures moved in silence. Logan sat straight in the saddle, his coat veiled in a film of dust, while Takya, the gaunt Apache woman, trudged behind. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm, but Takya's steps dragged heavy, as though shackled. Her bare feet bled, cracked heels caked with sand and thorn, yet she gave no sound of complaint. Her black hair fell over her sunburned face, shoulders trembling under the searing blaze. Whatever Apache pride she once carried had been burned away, leaving only obedience and resignation. Logan glanced back now and then. He said nothing, but his eyes were a warning. If you fall behind, if you betray me, I'll pull the trigger without hesitation. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the long howl of the desert wind, like a voice from another world. By noon, they halted at a dry ravine. Logan tied his horse, uncorked a water skin. He drank a mouthful, then tossed what was left to Takya. She caught it with both hands and drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, soaking into her throat like life itself. "Enough!" Logan snapped, jerking the skin back. "Learn restraint. Out here, water is worth more than blood." Takya lowered her head, wiped her mouth. She did not argue, did not resist, only stepped back. Logan stared at her a moment, then turned away, leading the horse onward. Beneath his sternness, he felt both contempt and something stranger. This woman endured more than he expected. By dusk, they reached a border town. Wooden houses leaned against each other, windows half shut, signs creaking in the wind. The main street lay under a blanket of red dust, dogs barking somewhere behind the shacks. The place looked quiet, but to Logan's eyes, tension and suspicion clung to every corner. The moment he rode in, eyes turned. Cowboys leaning on posts, with a crust of bread. Laughter cracked harsh. Logan turned, his cold eyes slicing across the room. The sound died at once. He drained his glass and set it down with a heavy thud. No words were needed. His silence weighed more than any threat. By sundown, Logan led his horse out of town. Takya followed, quiet as a shadow. But Logan had already heard it, hooves trailing from behind. At first tangled with the wind, then clearer. Along with them came low, cruel laughter from the brush. Takya whispered, "What is it?" "Quiet, stay close," Logan replied, his voice strung tight as a bow. Shadows stretched long, the road empty. On the blood-red sky, dust plumes rose behind. Logan tightened his reins, eyes narrowing. He knew the outlaws had marked him in the saloon. Now, with darkness falling, the trap was closing. Takya glanced around, lips pressed tight. She had no weapon, nothing but her scarred hands. Yet in her dark eyes there flickered something. Not just fear, but resolve. Logan caught the scent of gunpowder riding on the wind. Every sense sharpened. His hand tightened on the revolver, ready for what was coming. In the Wild West, fragile deals rarely lasted beyond a single day. And when the guns spoke, every promise, every fragile bond could dissolve into blood and dust. The sun hung high like a burning coal, scorching the desert sky. The dusty trail stretched endless, the heat so fierce the very air shimmered like a molten mirror. On that road, two figures moved in silence. Logan sat straight in the saddle, his coat veiled in a film of dust, while Takya, the gaunt Apache woman, trudged behind. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm, but Takya's steps dragged heavy, as though shackled. Her bare feet bled, cracked heels caked with sand and thorn. Yet she gave no sound of complaint. Her black hair fell over her sunburned face, shoulders trembling under the searing blaze. Whatever Apache pride she once carried had been burned away, leaving only obedience and resignation. Logan glanced back now and then. He said nothing, but his eyes were a warning. If you fall behind, if you betray me, I'll pull the trigger without hesitation. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the long howl of the desert wind, like a voice from another world. By noon, they halted at a dry ravine. Logan tied his horse, uncorked a water skin. He drank a mouthful, then tossed what was left to Takya. She caught it with both hands and drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, soaking into her throat like life itself. "Enough," Logan snapped, jerking the skin back. "Learn restraint. Out here, water is worth more than blood." Takya lowered her head, wiped her mouth. She did not argue, did not resist, only stepped back. Logan stared at her a moment, then turned away, leading the horse onward. Beneath his sternness, he felt both contempt and something stranger. This woman endured more than he expected. By dusk, they reached a border town. Wooden houses leaned against each other, windows half shut, signs creaking in the wind. The main street lay under a blanket of red dust, dogs barking somewhere behind the shacks. The place looked quiet, but to Logan's eyes, tension and suspicion clung to every corner. The moment he rode in, eyes turned. With a crust of bread, laughter cracked harsh. Logan turned, his cold eyes slicing across the room. The sound died at once. He drained his glass and set it down with a heavy thud. No words were needed. His silence weighed more than any threat. By sundown, Logan led his horse out of town. Takya followed, quiet as a shadow. But Logan had already heard it, hooves trailing from behind. At first tangled with the wind, then clearer. Along with them came low, cruel laughter from the brush. Takya whispered, "What is it?" "Quiet, stay close," Logan replied, his voice strung tight as a bow. Shadows stretched long, the road empty. On the blood-red sky, dust plumes rose behind. Logan tightened his reins, eyes narrowing. He knew the outlaws had marked him in the saloon. Now, with darkness falling, the trap was closing. Takya glanced around, lips pressed tight. She had no weapon, nothing but her scarred hands. Yet in her dark eyes there flickered something. Not just fear, but resolve. Logan caught the scent of gunpowder riding on the wind. The desert sky faded from crimson to violet. The last light of the sun bleeding like a wound across the horizon. A dry wind cut through the valley, stinging eyes and lips, carrying dust into every fold of clothing. Logan rode in front, his body stiff in the saddle, one hand heavy on the reins. Behind him, Takya stumbled through the sand, her bare feet cracked and bleeding. Still, she said nothing, her thin frame bent but unbroken, the stubborn will of survival keeping her close behind. The silence of the desert pressed in until Logan heard it. Another sound beneath the steady rhythm of his own horse's hooves. A second rhythm, hooves trailing them, gaining ground. His jaw tightened, gray eyes narrowing into the dusk. Takya raised her head, her lips trembling. Someone's following us. Quiet, stay close, Logan muttered, voice sharp, hand dropping to the Colt at his hip. From the dust behind, shadows took form. 4 riders burst out of the haze, faces wrapped in cloth, revolvers glinting. Laughter rolled across the flats, low and cruel. One of them bellowed, "Boone! Leave the squaw in your purse and maybe we'll let you keep your hide." Their jeers rattled like stones in a dry gully. Logan said nothing, spurring his horse forward, but the riders swept wider, boxing them in. A gunshot cracked. The bullet hissed past his ear and smacked into the sand. Logan's horse reared with a scream, nearly throwing him. He wrenched the reins, yanked free his Colt and fired twice. Flame burst from the muzzle. One rider toppled backward, crashing into the dust, blood soaking the sand. Takya screamed as she fell, tumbling into the roadside brush. Dust coated her face, but instead of fleeing, she seized a jagged stone and hurled it at a rider charging down on Logan. It smashed into his shoulder, pitching him sideways. Logan spared a glance, startled. Logan's breath and the ringing in his ears. The acrid stench of gunpowder hung heavy in the wind. Logan shoved the Colt back into its holster, chest heaving. He strode toward Takya. She sat slumped in the sand, shoulders shaking, the revolver slipping from her fingers. Her dark hair clung to her face, streaked with sweat and blood. "You just saved my hide," Logan rasped. Takya lifted her head. In the fire of her eyes, there was no trace of pleading anymore, only defiance, raw and unyielding. "I won't live as anyone's slave," she whispered. "If I live, I'll live on my own terms." Logan studied her long and hard. He frowned, turned away, but something shifted inside him. She was no longer just a starving shadow. For this night, she was his ally. Then, Takya's hand shot out, pointing to the ridge. "Look." Flames danced in the distance, dozens of them. And then the sound came, deep, rolling, relentless. The beat of drums. Apache war drums. Logan's gut clenched. From the ridge above, riders appeared one by one, silhouettes painted with streaks of red, feathers bristling from their hair. Spears gleamed, bows drawn tight. The drumming thundered down into the valley like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Takya froze, her face pale, lips quivering. "They are my people." Logan swung his gaze to her, eyes hard as steel. His hand tightened on the Colt. In front of him stretched a war party. Behind him stood the woman who had just saved his life. Trust her, or put her down before she turned. The drums beat louder, rolling like thunder. The wind screamed through the canyon, lifting curtains of dust that shimmered in the torchlight. Logan's horse stamped and snorted, ears flat, nostrils flaring, sensing the storm about to break. Logan sat unmoving, his jaw clenched, torn between instinct and the fleeting thread of trust. The night pressed close, heavy with fire and blood yet to spill. And in the Wild West, hesitation was death. The Apache drums thundered through the valley, each beat like a hammer slamming into the chest. With every strike, the ground beneath Logan and Takia seemed to tremble. Torches blazed on the ridge, sparks swirling into the air like falling stars. Apache horsemen appeared in the glow, dozens, then hundreds, closing in like wolves circling prey. Their faces streaked with red war paint, their eyes aflame, spears and bows glinting under the night sky. Logan tightened the reins. His horse screamed, stamping the earth, terrified by the smell of blood and the pounding of drums. Sweat trickled cold down Logan's spine, his hand locked around the Colt. A few bullets against a war party, that was suicide. Yet laying down his weapon meant a quicker death. Takia stood frozen beside him, her face pale in the firelight. Her lips trembled, her eyes caught between two fires. Before her stood her people, blood, kin, her lost home. Beside her stood Logan, the white man who had spared her life, who had let her live to see this night. An Apache chieftain rode forward. A streak of red paint slashed across his brow, eagle feathers bristling high behind him. His voice boomed across the valley. "Woman, return to your people. The white man is not your place. Stay with him and you will die with him." The war band roared as one, spears lifted, bows drawn. The beat of hooves rose like thunder, the chant echoing through the canyon. Logan's gray eyes cut toward Takia, cold and sharp. He didn't need words. His stare asked the question plain. "Who will you choose?" Takia's heart pounded so hard it stole her breath. Fear clawed at her chest. Yet beneath it, another fire burned, the will to survive. She saw again the night Logan did not pull the trigger. The crust of bread trembling in her hands. He had given her a chance, fragile as it was. The drums quickened. An Apache rider charged down, bow bent. "If that is your choice, then walk with him to the end. But know this, your tribe is no longer your home." His words cracked like thunder. The warriors roared, then wheeled their horses. Hooves shook the ground as they stormed away, torches vanishing into the darkness, drums fading to nothing. The valley fell into silence. Dust hung in the air. Only Logan and Takia remained, two shadows adrift in the desert night. Takia crumpled to her knees, tears streaking her hollow face. The last tie to her past had been severed. She was tribeless now, cut adrift forever. Logan stared down at her, eyes clouded with more than suspicion. He no longer saw a beggar or a burden. She had become something else, a castaway, as lost as he was. "You just gave up everything," Logan muttered. Takia lifted her head. Her eyes were rimmed red with grief, but in them burned a steady fire. She whispered, her words carried on the desert wind. "From now on, I have no home to return to." Logan clenched the reins. His horse pawed the ground, nostrils flaring. He looked out toward the black horizon, where the wind churned sand into a restless sea. The road ahead promised no peace, only blood, betrayal, and the brutal cost of survival. The desert wind swept over them, wrapping their two lonely figures in a shroud of dust. A cowboy and an Apache woman, both cast out, bound together now by nothing but survival itself. That night, beneath the dying firelight, their story did not end with victory. It ended with silence. Heavy, unresolved, hanging like a blade in the dark. And those who hear the tale of the Wild West are left with one question. When dawn comes, which of them will still be alive to tell it?